Wellington University stood like a fortress of knowledge, its towering Gothic architecture casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawns. The campus exuded an air of prestige, a place where history whispered through the ivy-covered walls, where generations of scholars had walked before. The very ground seemed to hum with the weight of legacy, an institution built on excellence, tradition, and power. But beneath its grandeur lay an unspoken truth. Wellington was a place of exclusivity, where the past dictated the present, where the seats in lecture halls were filled with the sons and daughters of senators, judges, and corporate titans. It was a university that prided itself on producing leaders, and yet, leadership here often had less to do with intelligence and more to do with birthright. In a sea of privilege, Michael Carter was an anomaly. The student body was overwhelmingly white, the diversity limited to a carefully curated few students who, despite their merit, often felt like guests in a house that was never built for them. The university brochure boasted about inclusion, but the reality was far less progressive. While students of color existed, they were scattered, few and far between, their presence often unnoticed or, worse, quietly questioned. For Michael, the walls of Wellington were lined with reminders that he did not belong. It was in the way some professors barely acknowledged him, their eyes sweeping over him in discussions. It was in the subtle hesitation of classmates before engaging with him, as if his presence required an explanation. It was in the hushed whispers in hallways, in the way students spoke of tradition and heritage, as if those very words did not carry the weight of exclusion. Inside the grand lecture halls, beneath the stained glass windows and chandeliers, Michael often felt like an outsider in his own education. And yet, he had earned his place. He was not here because of luck, nor because of charity. He was here because he had worked for it, because every late night spent buried in books, every sacrifice, every hour of study had led him to this moment. But Wellington was not just about intelligence. It was about perception, and perception had never been on Michael Carter's side. No one would call him incompetent outright, but they did not have to. Their skepticism came in softer forms, in the second glances at his test scores, in the way his successes were met with surprise rather than expectation. And then there were those who saw him as nothing more than a token, an example of progress. Michael had grown used to it. He had learned how to navigate these spaces, how to exist without making himself too visible. He had learned that excellence, for someone like him, was not just expected, it was the bare minimum. And even then, it was often not enough. Michael Carter had always been a quiet force, brilliant but restrained, present but never imposing. He walked the halls of Wellington University with a quiet confidence, his steps measured, his gaze focused. He was not one to seek attention, nor did he expect it. He had learned early on that the world did not offer validation freely, especially not to people like him. He was intelligent, perhaps more than most of his classmates, but he never flaunted it. Instead, he let his work speak for itself. Every essay meticulously crafted, every argument sharpened with precision, every exam an opportunity to prove, if not to them, then at least to himself, that he belonged. But belonging was a complicated thing. Michael understood that his presence at Wellington was not viewed the same way as others. For many, it was a given, their names were legacies, their admissions an inevitability. For him, it was something that had been earned through late nights of study, through sacrifices his parents made, through years of relentless effort. And yet, even as one of the top students in his class, recognition rarely came. He sat in the front rows but was often overlooked when he raised his hand. He turned in assignments that received little more than a nod, while lesser work from others was praised as exceptional. He carried himself with quiet dignity, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing frustration, of seeing doubt. But doubt was there, buried beneath the surface. Not in his ability, Michael knew he was capable, but in the way the world around him refused to see it. Michael Carter had one goal, one singular ambition that fueled every late-night study session, every note he meticulously took, every book he pored over long after the library emptied. He wanted to graduate at the top of his class, not just as proof of his intelligence, not just to secure his future, but as a statement, an undeniable testament that he belonged, that his place at Wellington University was not a mistake or a concession, that he had earned it. For others, excellence was a tradition, expected and inevitable. They came from families where success was a birthright, where their names alone could open doors that others had to break down. But for Michael, success had always been a battle. He knew that to survive at Wellington, being good was not enough. He had to be exceptional, flawless, unshakable, and even then, it might still not be enough. There were no explicit barriers, no outright refusals. No professor would ever say he didn't belong. No student would openly tell him he wasn't wanted. The discrimination at Wellington was quieter, more insidious, an invisible weight pressing against him at all times. It was in the way professors hesitated before calling on him, often choosing another student instead. It was in the way some of his classmates spoke with a forced politeness, an artificial friendliness that never quite extended into real invitations, real friendships. It was in the way people acted surprised, always surprised, when he excelled. It was in the way they asked, "How did you do so well on that exam?" in a tone that wasn't admiration, but doubt. It was in the way his achievements were met with silence, while others, whose work was no better than his, were praised and celebrated. Michael saw it all. He felt it in every interaction, every conversation, every moment that reminded him that no matter how hard he worked, he would always be working against something more than just academics. But that didn't stop him. If anything, it pushed him further. He didn't argue. He didn't demand respect. He didn't ask for recognition. He just worked, because in the end, the numbers wouldn't lie. The results would be undeniable. And when graduation day came, when the names of the top students were announced, he wanted to hear his own standing above the rest. Not because he wanted validation, but because, after everything, he wanted them to have no choice but to see him. Michael Carter was not just a good student, he was exceptional. From the very first week at Wellington, he had proven himself. His essays were sharper, his analyses deeper, his arguments more compelling. In a classroom filled with privileged intellects and overconfident legacies, Michael stood out. Not by force, not by arrogance, but by sheer ability. But ability, as he quickly learned, was not always enough. His name was never the one spoken with admiration in the hallways. His work was never the one that professors highlighted as exemplary. His insights, though often the most well-researched in the room, were met with polite nods instead of enthusiasm. It was as if his excellence was acknowledged, but never truly accepted. When tests were returned, Michael's scores were often at the very top. He had mastered the material not just to pass but to dominate, to ensure that there could be no doubt, no questioning of his intellect. And yet, there was always doubt, always skepticism, always the raised eyebrows from his classmates when they saw his name above theirs. It was never outright malice. No one ever openly challenged his achievements, but the silence was just as loud. The disbelief, the whispered conversations, the subtle dismissals. It all sent the same message. You're not supposed to be better than us. Michael was used to being challenged. Back in high school, when he aced tests, his classmates would ask for help, respect in their voices. His teachers would praise his dedication, pushing him to achieve more. But at Wellington, it was different. Here, he wasn't asked how he studied. He wasn't invited to join study groups, even though he consistently outperformed the students who led them. Instead, he was met with carefully veiled comments, the kind meant to appear casual but carried an undeniable weight. "Man, I barely passed that exam. How the hell did you do so well? You must have some insane memory or something. Guess some people just get lucky, huh? Luck." As if the endless nights he spent poring over textbooks were irrelevant. As if his success was accidental rather than earned. There were even times when his work was questioned in ways others weren't. Once, after receiving the highest score on a political theory paper, Michael had been pulled aside by his professor. "This was impressive, Michael," the professor had said, his tone measured. "Very well argued, almost too well. Did you receive any outside help?" Michael had blinked, momentarily thrown off. "No, I wrote it myself." The professor had nodded, but Michael could see it. The hesitation, the underlying doubt. A student like him producing work this good? It must have been checked, edited, perhaps even written by someone else. Michael had clenched his jaw, swallowed his frustration, and simply said, "I put a lot of effort into it. I'm glad you found it compelling." The professor had smiled, but the doubt never fully left his expression. Then there were the discussions. Michael loved debates. He loved the back and forth, the intellectual sparring that came from challenging ideas, from dismantling weak arguments and building stronger ones in their place. But in class, it rarely played out in his favor. He would raise his hand, prepared with a well-structured counterpoint, only to be overlooked. Time and time again, Professor Richardson would scan the room, pause near Michael, then choose someone else. And when he did call on Michael, it often felt like a test, not an opportunity. "Interesting perspective," Richardson would say after Michael spoke. "But have you considered?" He never dismissed Michael outright, but there was an edge to his responses, a subtle undermining that made it clear. Michael's words were not to be taken at face value. If a white student had said the same thing, Richardson might have nodded, might have encouraged further discussion. But with Michael, there was always that extra layer of scrutiny. That unspoken, ever-present question, "Are you really as smart as you seem?" Michael tried not to let it affect him, tried to remind himself that it didn't matter whether they saw it or not. His grades spoke for themselves. His work was solid. His intelligence was real. But even so, it was exhausting. Exhausting to be the best and still be doubted. Exhausting to outshine others and still feel invisible. Exhausting to prove himself over and over again, knowing that no matter how much he succeeded, there would always be someone waiting to question why. And yet, he never stopped, because stopping meant accepting their version of him. And Michael Carter refused to let anyone else define his worth. Professor James Richardson was a man of tradition. For over 3 decades, he had been a fixture at Wellington University, shaping the minds of future leaders, politicians, and scholars. He was respected, admired, even feared by some students. His grading was harsh, his expectations high, and his standards, at least on the surface, were unwavering. But Michael had come to realize something. Richardson wasn't just strict. He was selective. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those who had never experienced it firsthand. There were no outright insults, no direct dismissals, nothing that could be called discrimination in the legal sense. And yet, it was there, woven into the very fabric of his classroom. Michael saw it every day. He saw it in the way Richardson favored certain students, particularly those who came from the right families, the right backgrounds. He saw it in the way he nurtured their ideas, encouraged their voices, challenged them, but always with respect, always with the assumption that they were capable. And he saw it in the way he treated Michael. It started with the small things, a discussion on political theory. Michael raised his hand, his thoughts fully formed, his argument precise. But Richardson's gaze drifted past him, settling instead on another student. "Ah, Josh, what do you think?" Josh Ellington, who hadn't even bothered to open his textbook the night before, sat up straighter, scrambling for an answer. Well, I think Machiavelli was saying that leaders should be, kind of ruthless. Do whatever it takes." It was vague, half-formed, lacking any real substance. Richardson nodded approvingly. A fair interpretation. Now let's explore that further. Michael lowered his hand. This had happened before. It would happen again. Then there were the essays. Michael was meticulous in his work. His writing was structured, his arguments logical, his research thorough. And yet, when his papers were returned, they often bore comments that felt oddly dismissive. Good analysis, but could use more depth. Interesting take, but consider refining your argument further. Michael read through the feedback carefully, comparing it to essays from other students. Josh's paper had received a higher grade, despite being riddled with weak assertions and lacking proper citations. It wasn't just an occasional mistake. It was a pattern. Michael tested it once, submitting 2 different essays, one under his name, the other anonymously through a group submission. The anonymous one, though slightly weaker, received a higher score. That was when Michael knew. Richardson was grading him, not just his work. The favoritism was most apparent during class debates. Wellington prided itself on fostering intellectual discourse, and Richardson encouraged heated discussions. But only when the right people were speaking. Michael had spent hours preparing for a debate on economic inequality, gathering historical data, refining his counterarguments. The discussion began, and as expected, the usual voices dominated the room: Josh, Emily, a few other students from affluent backgrounds. Michael listened carefully, waiting for the right moment to interject. Then, when a weak point was made, he leaned forward and spoke. Actually, the data from the last 20 years contradicts that point. If we examine Richardson cut him off before he could finish. Let's allow others to weigh in first, Michael. Michael sat back, jaw tightening. Josh, taking the opportunity, jumped in. He repeated almost exactly what Michael had just said, only reworded slightly. Richardson nodded. Now that's an interesting argument. Michael felt his fingers clench into fists under the desk. Sarah saw it too. After class, she caught up with Michael as they walked across campus. That was bullshit, she said, blunt as ever. Michael exhaled slowly. What part? Sarah scoffed. Every part. You literally said the same thing Josh did, but when you said it, Richardson dismissed it. When Josh said it, suddenly it was an interesting argument. Michael shrugged. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Michael stopped walking and turned to her. Sarah, this isn't new. This isn't surprising. I've been dealing with this since I got here. Sarah hesitated, frustration flashing across her face. But it's not fair. Michael let out a short laugh, humorless. It never was. Richardson's bias was never loud. He would never say outright that Michael was less intelligent, less capable. But his actions spoke for him. He treated Michael's successes as anomalies, his failures, when they happened, as proof of something deeper. And the worst part? No one ever called him out on it. Because Wellington was filled with students who didn't need to notice. For them, Richardson was simply a tough professor, one who held his students to high standards. For Michael, he was a wall that Michael had no choice but to climb. Josh Ellington had never been the smartest student in the room, but he had always been treated like he was. His father was a well-known federal judge. His grandfather had graduated from Wellington before him, and his family name carried weight in the university's halls. Josh had grown up believing that he was meant to succeed, not because of extraordinary talent, but because that was how the world worked for people like him. Then Michael Carter came along. At first, Josh hadn't noticed him. He was just another face in the crowd, another student sitting quietly in lectures, taking notes, doing his work. But then the test scores came back. Michael's name was at the top, every time, higher than Josh's, higher than anyone's. That was when the whispers started. Who the hell is Carter? Josh had muttered to Emily one afternoon, staring at the results posted on the department bulletin board. Emily smirked. Oh, you mean the genius? Apparently he's some scholarship kid. Josh scoffed. Figures. Emily tilted her head. What do you mean? Josh shrugged. Come on. You know how these things work. You think he's actually smarter than the rest of us? Emily gave a knowing smile. I mean, maybe he just works harder. Josh rolled his eyes. Or maybe he just got lucky, and that became the narrative. Michael wasn't smarter. He wasn't better. He was just lucky. Josh and Emily didn't need to openly insult Michael. Their words were never direct. The way they dismissed him was more insidious, more calculated. It was in the way Josh made sure to speak just a little louder when Michael was nearby. Honestly, some people don't realize how much their grades are inflated. I mean, some of us actually have to work for our success. Emily would laugh, flipping her hair over her shoulder. I know, right? And some people just have advantages. Josh smirked. Exactly. Wellington loves a good success story. Makes the school look good, you know? They never said Michael's name. They didn't have to. He heard them. He always heard them. But he never reacted. He never gave them the satisfaction of seeing frustration on his face. Instead, he worked harder. And the harder he worked, the more they hated him for it. Josh became obsessed with outperforming Michael. He spent hours in the library, not because he wanted to learn, but because he refused to accept that Michael was simply better than him. But no matter how hard he tried, the results never changed. And that was what made him angry. Emily saw it too. She noticed the way Josh's jaw clenched when test scores were posted. The way he stared at Michael across the lecture hall. A silent challenge in his eyes. One day, after yet another exam where Michael had scored higher, Emily leaned in and whispered, "It's actually kind of embarrassing for you, Josh." Josh scowled. "Shut up." Emily smirked. "I'm serious. You used to be top of the class. Now, you're getting beaten by someone no one even knew existed a year ago." Josh exhaled sharply, tapping his pen against the desk. "He's not beating me. He just got lucky." Emily raised an eyebrow. 3 times in a row? That's a lot of luck. Josh's grip on his pen tightened. "It won't happen again." Emily tilted her head, amused. "Oh? And what are you gonna do about it?" Josh didn't answer, but deep down he knew. Michael wasn't just lucky. And that made him furious. The resentment only grew. Whenever Michael spoke in class, Josh and Emily would exchange glances, rolling their eyes as if whatever he had said wasn't worth listening to. If Michael made a strong point during a debate, Emily would mutter, "God, does he always have to act like he knows everything?" If he won an academic award, Josh would scoff, "Guess Wellington needs their diversity quota filled." Their words weren't always loud, but they were always meant to be heard. Michael didn't respond. He didn't argue, but that didn't mean he didn't feel it. He felt it every single day. Sarah saw it too. She had noticed the way Josh and Emily talked about Michael, the way their smiles never quite reached their eyes when they spoke to him. One afternoon, after class, Sarah turned to Michael and sighed. "Do they ever stop?" Michael didn't look up from his notes. "Who?" Sarah gave him a look. "Josh, Emily, the rest of them." Michael let out a short, dry chuckle. "Why would they?" Sarah hesitated. "You don't have to just take it, you know?" Michael finally looked up at her. "And do what, Sarah? Fight them? Call them out? What do you think that'll change?" Sarah pressed her lips together, frustrated but unable to argue. Michael sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't need them to like me. I don't need their approval. I just need to keep winning." Sarah exhaled slowly. "And if they never accept that?" Michael's gaze hardened. "Then I'll make it impossible for them to ignore me." Sarah Walker had always been different from the others. She wasn't like Josh or Emily. She didn't come from a family of politicians or wealthy executives. Her parents were both teachers, firm believers that education should be about merit, not legacy. That belief had shaped Sarah's view of the world. And from the very beginning, she had seen what others chose to ignore. She had noticed how Michael was treated in class. She had seen the way Professor Richardson overlooked him, the way students whispered when he outperformed them, the way Josh and Emily's laughter always seemed a little louder when Michael was within earshot. And it bothered her. Sarah wasn't naive. She knew that Wellington wasn't built for people like Michael. But the blatant unfairness of it all made her angry. One afternoon, after yet another lecture where Michael had been ignored despite knowing the answer, she found him sitting on a bench outside the library, flipping through his notebook. She sat down next to him without asking. "You know that was bullshit, right?" she said. Michael didn't look up. "What was?" Sarah scoffed. "Richardson, the way he skipped over you again. You literally wrote an entire paper on that exact topic. And he still called on Josh instead." Michael turned a page in his notebook, his expression unreadable. "It's fine." Sarah frowned. "It's not fine. You should say something." Michael finally looked at her, his gaze calm but firm. "And what do you think that'll change?" Sarah hesitated. She wanted to tell him that things would get better if he spoke up, that people would listen. But she wasn't sure that was true. Instead, she sighed. It's just not fair. Michael gave a small, humorless chuckle. It never is. Sarah admired Michael in ways she rarely admitted out loud. He never complained, never lashed out, never let them see how much it all weighed on him. She wasn't sure how he did it. One night, while studying in the library together, she finally asked, "How do you deal with it?" Michael glanced up from his notes. "Deal with what?" "All of it. The way they act like you don't belong here." Michael tapped his pen against the desk, thinking for a moment. "I don't need them to believe I belong." Sarah tilted her head. "No," Michael smirked slightly. "I just need to make sure they can't ignore me." There was a quiet determination in his voice, something unshakable. Sarah found herself smiling. Good. Despite everything, Michael and Sarah's friendship had never been forced. It wasn't built on pity or obligation. It was built on understanding. Sarah wasn't just someone who felt bad for Michael. She saw him, not as an anomaly, not as a symbol, but as Michael Carter, the smartest person she had ever met, the hardest working student at Wellington, the one person who refused to let the system break him. And no matter what happened, she would always remind him of that. The tension in the lecture hall was palpable. It had started as a routine discussion, another day in Professor Richardson's political theory class, another analysis of governance, power, and authority. The students sat in their usual places, some engaged, some barely pretending to take notes. The air buzzed with the low hum of whispered conversations, the occasional rustle of papers. Michael Carter sat near the front, as always, focused, prepared. Today's topic: the ethics of leadership in Machiavellian philosophy. Professor Richardson leaned against his desk, arms crossed, surveying the room with a knowing smirk. "So, tell me," he began, "is it better for a leader to be loved or feared? Which is more effective in maintaining power?" A few hands went up immediately. Josh Ellington, of course, was among the first. Richardson nodded toward him. "Josh." Josh straightened in his seat, smirking as he spoke. "Fear, obviously. People in power stay in power because they're ruthless. That's how it's always been." A few students nodded in agreement. Richardson gave an approving nod. "A classic interpretation. Anyone else?" Michael raised his hand. For a brief second, Richardson hesitated. Then, with a tight smile, he gestured toward him. "Yes, Michael." Michael sat up, his voice steady. "I disagree. Machiavelli doesn't argue that fear is the most effective tool. He argues that a ruler should avoid being hated. The key distinction isn't fear versus love. It's control. A leader who relies purely on fear creates instability. The real question is how power is sustained over time." The room fell silent, because of course Michael was right, and everyone knew it. But then, Josh scoffed. Loudly, "Oh, come on," he muttered, shaking his head. "Leave it to Carter to turn this into some moral debate." A few students chuckled. Emily smirked, nudging Josh playfully. Michael felt the shift in the room. He ignored it. He turned back to Richardson, waiting for the professor to respond, to acknowledge the argument. But Richardson only tilted his head, a condescending glint in his eyes. And then he said it. "I don't think anyone in this class needs a lecture from you, Michael." The words cut through the air like a blade. The reaction was immediate. Laughter rippled through the room. Hushed snickers and amused glances exchanged across the rows. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what stunned him more: the words themselves, or the way Richardson said them. Casual, effortless, like a passing remark, like a joke. And yet, it was anything but. Sarah froze in her seat. She had seen Richardson's bias before, had witnessed his dismissals of Michael's arguments, his reluctance to acknowledge Michael's intelligence. But this was different. This wasn't just ignoring Michael. This was humiliating him. Michael sat there, his hands tightening into fists beneath the desk. He could feel the stares, the smirks, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. 100 different responses ran through his mind. Challenging Richardson, demanding an explanation, calling out the blatant disrespect. But he knew how that would go. If he pushed back, he would be labeled overly sensitive. If he got angry, he would be proving their point. If he walked out, he would be seen as unable to handle criticism. There was no right way to respond, and Richardson knew that. Josh leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Relax, Carter," he said, voice dripping with amusement. "Don't take it personally. Not everyone gets to be the expert." Another laugh from the students. Michael exhaled slowly. His pulse pounded in his ears. Not because he was embarrassed, not because he doubted himself, but because in that moment he saw it. Asterisk asterisk the game they were playing. Asterisk asterisk. It had never been about his intelligence. It had never been about his work. It had always been about making sure he knew his place. And for the first time, Michael wasn't sure if he could keep quiet anymore. The laughter lingered in the air, stretching out longer than it should have. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to turn the moment from an awkward dismissal into something far worse. A spectacle. Michael sat still, his pulse pounding, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He willed himself not to react, not to flinch, not to let his expression shift, not to let them see that it had hit him. But it had, because this was different. This wasn't just Richardson ignoring him. This was mockery, delivered with the kind of effortless authority that made it acceptable. And the worst part? No one said a word against it. Some students chuckled softly, exchanging glances, as if they had just witnessed something amusing but ultimately insignificant. A few others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting to Michael before quickly looking away, as if afraid that meeting his gaze might implicate them in some way. Emily smirked, leaning toward Josh. Guess even Richardson's tired of his speeches. Josh grinned. Took him long enough. The words weren't loud, but Michael heard them. Of course he did. Every whisper, every hushed giggle, every glance. It all cut deeper than anything Richardson had said, because this wasn't just about one professor anymore. This was the entire room agreeing that he was beneath them. And then there was Sarah. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't even moved. She sat there, frozen, her hands clenched together in her lap. A war was raging behind her eyes. Michael could see it. Sarah wanted to say something. She wanted to push back, to call it out, to turn to Richardson and demand why he thought humiliating a student in front of an entire class was acceptable. But she didn't, because she knew what would happen if she did. She knew how easily her voice could be dismissed, how quickly her defense of Michael could be brushed off as an overreaction, a misunderstanding, misplaced outrage. And worse, she knew that if she spoke up, it wouldn't change anything. It would only make it worse for Michael. So she stayed silent. And Michael knew why. He didn't blame her, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The discussion moved on as if nothing had happened. Richardson continued, his tone smooth, effortless, as though he hadn't just torn down a student in front of an entire class, as though Michael's voice had never mattered to begin with. Michael sat there listening but not really hearing. The humiliation settled in his chest, heavy and suffocating. He had worked so hard to prove himself. He had spent years making sure his arguments were undeniable, his knowledge solid, his reasoning flawless, and none of it had mattered, because all it took was one sentence from the wrong person, and suddenly his intelligence was a joke. The bell rang. Chairs scraped against the floor as students gathered their belongings, conversations picking up again as if nothing had happened. Michael packed his notebook slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to breathe, to pull himself together, to pretend. Sarah stood beside him, hesitating. "Michael!" He shook his head. "Don't!" She flinched, then exhaled sharply. But she didn't say anything else, because, for now, there was nothing to say. It wasn't just that one moment in class. It never was. What had happened with Richardson, the way he humiliated Michael in front of everyone, was just the most obvious example. The truth was, it had been happening all along. Michael had seen it in his grades, in the way assignments were evaluated, in the way certain students seemed to get ahead without ever truly earning it. It wasn't about effort. It wasn't about intelligence. It was about who the professors wanted to see succeed. And Michael was never on that list. It started with the grading. Michael poured himself into his essays. Every paper he submitted was meticulously researched, structured with precision, arguments sharpened to perfection. He knew his work was strong, and yet the grades always came back lower than expected, always marked with vague criticism. Good analysis, but lacks depth. Interesting perspective, but needs more refinement. Consider expanding your argument further. The comments were always just vague enough that they couldn't be challenged outright. But Michael wasn't stupid. He had compared his work to others. He had seen weaker essays from Josh and Emily receive higher scores. He had seen lazy, surface-level arguments praised as insightful simply because they came from the right students. He had even seen clear mistakes overlooked in some students' work, mistakes that, if he had made them, would have been circled in red ink with a deduction in points. The pattern was obvious, but no one else seemed to care. One day, Michael decided to test it. He took an old essay, one that had been marked down for lack of depth, and resubmitted it under another student's name. The result? A higher grade, a different set of comments. Strong argument, well articulated. Impressive critical thinking. Michael stared at the feedback, his jaw clenched. It wasn't about the work. It was about who they thought was writing it. Then there were the recommendations. Michael had applied for an advanced research program, something that could significantly boost his academic career. The selection process was supposed to be based on merit, on academic performance, on genuine ability. He had the grades. He had the qualifications. But when the list of accepted students was posted, his name wasn't on it. Josh's was. Michael knew for a fact that Josh's GPA was lower, that Josh had struggled in half the courses required for the program. And yet, there he was. Michael overheard him talking to Emily about it later that day. "Yeah, my dad put in a call for me, said it'd be a good opportunity. Apparently, Professor Richardson vouched for me, too." Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. He had known, of course. He had always known that this was how things worked. But hearing it out loud, hearing Josh say it so casually, so confidently, as if it was just another benefit of his last name, as if it was something he was entitled to, made Michael feel sick. The worst part? It wasn't just Richardson. It was the whole system. Professors who favored students from well-connected families. Administrators who pretended to value fairness but made exceptions behind closed doors. Students who weren't necessarily smarter or more deserving, but who had the right names, the right networks, the right advantages. And Michael had none of that. He had only his work, only his determination, and somehow it still wasn't enough. Sarah saw it too. One afternoon, as they sat in the library, she slammed a notebook shut, frustration clear in her expression. "I don't get it." Michael glanced up from his textbook. "Get what?" Sarah exhaled sharply. "How they keep getting away with it." Michael gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Because no one cares, Sarah." She frowned. "I care." Michael studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "That's not enough." Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "It should be." But it wasn't, because no matter how hard Michael worked, no matter how much he proved himself, the system was built to favor the ones who never had to try. And Michael had to be better, not just equal, better, because if he wasn't undeniable, they would make him invisible. And that wasn't an option. Michael sat alone in the library that evening, staring at the open textbook in front of him. The words blurred together, unreadable, meaningless. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his studies. He was thinking about his future, and whether he even had one here. Everything that had happened over the past few weeks played in his mind like a never-ending reel. Richardson's dismissal, the laughter in class, the unfair grading, Josh's smug, effortless privilege. Michael had always believed that if he worked hard enough, it wouldn't matter. That the system, as broken as it was, would have no choice but to acknowledge him if he became undeniable. But now he wasn't so sure. He had done everything right. He had studied harder than anyone. He had scored the highest on exams. He had proven his intelligence over and over again. And still, they refused to see him. Still, he was treated like an imposter, like an intruder in a world that wasn't meant for him. The truth settled in his chest, heavy and suffocating. Was it even worth it? For the first time, Michael considered leaving. Not just Wellington. The whole thing. What was the point of playing a game rigged against him? If they had already decided that his success wasn't legitimate, then why was he still trying to prove them wrong? Why was he still fighting for something that might never come? His fingers tightened around the edges of his notebook, because this wasn't just about him. Michael thought about his parents. His father, who had worked double shifts at the factory just to afford the application fees for Wellington. His mother, who had stayed up late helping him with essays even when she had to wake up early for work. He thought about every sacrifice they had made to get him here. And what would he say to them if he quit? That the world was unfair? That the system was rigged? That despite everything, he had let them win? Michael couldn't accept that. He refused to, because if he gave up now, then they were right about him. Josh, Richardson, the whole damn university. They were waiting for him to fail. They expected it. And that was exactly why he couldn't. Michael inhaled sharply, closing his book. If they wanted to ignore him, fine. But he wasn't going anywhere. He would work harder. He would push further. He would become so undeniably brilliant that they would have no choice but to recognize him. And if they still refused, then he would force them to, one way or another. Michael made a decision that night. He wouldn't argue. He wouldn't complain. He wouldn't try to change their minds with words. He would let his work speak for itself. If they doubted him, fine. If they dismissed him, fine. But they wouldn't be able to ignore the results. The next morning, he walked into class with a new mindset. He didn't engage with the whispers. He didn't react to the smirks from Josh and Emily. He didn't look at Richardson longer than necessary. He simply sat down, opened his notebook, and started writing. From that moment on, nothing else mattered. Not the laughter, not the unfair treatment, not the silent exclusions, only his work. Michael became relentless. His days were consumed by study. Every lecture, he took notes with razor-sharp focus. Every assigned reading, he analyzed beyond the required chapters. Every exam, he approached with the mindset that failure wasn't an option. While others went to parties, he stayed in the library. While Josh and his friends bragged about connections, Michael built knowledge. Because if he couldn't change the system, he would beat it. And if he couldn't get their respect, he would settle for undeniable results. His transformation didn't go unnoticed. Sarah saw it first. They used to talk in between classes, but now Michael barely acknowledged anyone. He was always studying, always moving, always working on something. One afternoon, she finally spoke up. "Michael, you need to take a break." He didn't even glance up from his textbook. "I don't have time," Sarah sighed. "You can't just shut everything out." Michael exhaled sharply, finally looking at her. "What do you want me to do, Sarah? Argue? Fight? Complain? It won't change anything." Sarah frowned. "That's not the point." Michael's gaze darkened. "Then what is?" Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind." Because the truth was, she understood. The results of Michael's efforts soon became undeniable. In class discussions, his answers were sharper than ever. On written assignments, his essays were meticulously structured, impossible to critique. On tests, he didn't just pass. He dominated. Michael was at the top of every score list, outperforming even the students Richardson openly favored. And for the first time, people started noticing. Not the professors, not the administration, but the students. Because when someone beats you again and again, you have no choice but to acknowledge them. And Michael was winning, over and over and over again. Josh hated it. Every time a test score was posted, Every time Michael's name was at the top, Josh's resentment deepened. One afternoon, after another exam where Michael had placed first, Josh slammed his books onto the table in frustration. "This is bullshit." Emily glanced at him. "What is?" Josh scoffed. "Carter, he's not that smart. I don't know how the hell he's doing it, but there's no way he's actually better than everyone." Emily smirked. "Maybe he's just working harder." Josh scowled. "Or maybe he's cheating." Emily rolled her eyes. "You sound desperate." But Josh wasn't listening, because to him, there was no other explanation. Meanwhile, Richardson's silence was deafening. Before, he had subtly undermined Michael. Now, he barely acknowledged him. He couldn't, because Michael wasn't just succeeding. Asterisk asterisk, he was making Richardson's bias impossible to ignore. Asterisk asterisk. If he continued grading Michael unfairly, people would notice. If he dismissed Michael in discussions, people would wonder why. Michael had left him with no way out, because excellence is the one thing even the most biased professor can't fully erase. And Michael was determined to be unerasable. The exams were supposed to be the great equalizer. No bias, no favoritism, just pure, undeniable results. And for Michael, this was his moment. He had spent weeks preparing, studying every possible angle of the material. While others skimmed through summaries, he read entire texts cover to cover. While they memorized formulas, he understood them, because he knew. Asterisk asterisk, this wasn't just about passing. Asterisk asterisk, this was about proving something. Not just to Richardson, not just to Josh, but to everyone. The first major exam was in political ethics, one of the most difficult courses at Wellington. The classroom was silent as students scribbled furiously, eyes locked onto their papers. Michael's pen moved swiftly, his thoughts flowing effortlessly onto the page. Question after question, he nailed every response. He didn't just answer. Asterisk asterisk, he built arguments. Asterisk asterisk, he didn't just repeat what had been taught. Asterisk asterisk, he expanded on it. Asterisk asterisk. By the time he set his pen down, he knew. He had aced it. 2 weeks later, the results were posted. Michael scanned the list of scores. His heart pounded in anticipation. And there it was. Michael Carter, 98%. The highest score in the class. A rush of satisfaction filled his chest. This was it. Undeniable proof. He turned to leave, only to hear Josh scoff behind him. Figures. Michael turned slowly. What's that supposed to mean? Josh smirked. Oh, nothing. Just funny how you always do so well. Almost like it's rigged in your favor. Michael stared at him, barely believing what he was hearing. Josh, of all people, talking about things being rigged. He felt his jaw tighten. Maybe I just studied harder than you. Josh snorted. Or maybe some people get special treatment. Michael exhaled sharply, forcing himself to walk away, because if he stayed, he might say something he couldn't take back. The next challenge was the Wellington Research Fellowship exam, an exclusive test that determined which students would be offered a position in the university's most prestigious academic program. Michael needed this. It was more than an achievement. It was a gateway to bigger opportunities, graduate programs, real recognition. So he prepared harder than ever. He spent every waking hour absorbing information, refining his critical analysis, perfecting his essay structures. When exam day came, he was ready. And when he finished, he knew he had delivered one of the best papers of his life. A week passed. Then the results came in. Michael sat at his desk, laptop open, refreshing the web page. The list of accepted students appeared. His eyes scanned the names. Josh Ellington, Emily Carter, Daniel Whitmore, Michael Carter, nowhere. His heart sank. He checked again, and again. It wasn't a mistake. He had been excluded, despite having the highest scores in the class, despite his paper being flawless, despite everything. Sarah found him later that day in the library, sitting in stunned silence. "Michael," she asked carefully. He didn't respond. She hesitated before sitting across from him. The fellowship list came out. Michael gave a short laugh, humorless. Yeah, I saw. Sarah frowned. I don't understand. You should have been first on that list. Michael finally looked at her, his eyes dark with frustration. I wasn't even on it. Sarah's expression fell. What? Michael exhaled slowly. I emailed the committee. Sarah leaned in. And? Michael let out a bitter chuckle. They said there were other factors taken into account beyond the test scores. Sarah's face twisted in disgust. That's bullshit. Michael nodded. Yeah, it is. Later that day, as he left campus, he ran into Richardson. The professor was speaking with another faculty member, but when his gaze landed on Michael, a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Michael recognized that look. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't malice. It was calm certainty. Certainty that Michael had learned his lesson. Certainty that he wouldn't fight back. Certainty that he would accept his place. Michael clenched his fists, and in that moment he made a new decision. This wasn't over. Sarah was furious. She paced back and forth in the library, arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched. Michael sat across from her, silent, watching as she struggled to find the right words. You have to report this, she finally said, stopping abruptly. Michael exhaled, rubbing his temples. Sarah. No, she snapped. Don't Sarah me. This isn't just unfair, Michael. This is blatant discrimination. They didn't even try to hide it. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to stay calm. And what do you think will happen if I do? Sarah threw up her hands. I don't know. Maybe they'll have to answer for it. Maybe they'll realize they can't just... ***. Michael let out a bitter laugh. They won't. Sarah faltered. How can you be so sure? Michael looked at her, his eyes tired but firm. Because I've seen this before. We both have. Michael wasn't naive. He knew how this worked. If he filed a complaint, there would be meetings, investigations, carefully worded emails from the administration. They would say all the right things. They would promise to look into the matter, to ensure fairness for all students, to take these allegations seriously. But at the end of it all, nothing would change. Richardson would still be a respected professor. Josh and his friends would still believe they belonged here more than him. The faculty would close ranks, protecting their own. And Michael would be labeled a troublemaker. Someone who couldn't handle healthy academic competition. Someone who was playing the victim. Someone who didn't know his place. Sarah's voice softened. Michael, this isn't just about you. If you don't speak up, they'll keep doing this to other students like you. Michael looked away, jaw tight. You think I don't know that? Sarah reached across the table, gripping his wrist. Then why won't you fight this? Michael met her gaze, his voice quiet but steady. Because they're waiting for me to. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? Michael inhaled deeply. If I go to the administration, I lose. Either they ignore it or they turn it against me. I become the problem, not Richardson. Sarah shook her head, frustrated. So what then? You just let them get away with it? Michael exhaled sharply. No, I just don't fight on their terms. Sarah studied him for a long moment. She had never seen Michael like this before. He wasn't just angry. He was calculating. This wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. So what's your plan then? Michael's expression was unreadable. I win. Sarah frowned. You already did, and they still found a way to shut you out. Michael shook his head. Not like this. Not through their system. I have to win in a way they can't ignore. Sarah exhaled, rubbing her temples. Michael, that sounds dangerously close to a revenge plan. Michael's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. Call it what you want. Sarah studied him, searching for hesitation. She found none. And that scared her a little. Because Michael wasn't just trying to succeed anymore. He was trying to break the system that kept him down. And Sarah had no idea how far he was willing to go. The classroom was silent, the kind of silence that only came before a storm. Professor Richardson stood at the front. his usual air of authority wrapped around him like a cloak. The topic of today's discussion: moral responsibility in leadership. A discussion that, under normal circumstances, would have been just another routine debate. But today it wouldn't be routine, because today Michael had decided he was done being silent. Richardson cleared his throat, pacing slowly across the lecture hall. So, he began. Can a leader ever justify unethical actions for the greater good? History certainly seems to think so. A few students murmured in agreement. Josh raised his hand, smirking slightly. Machiavelli argued that power isn't about morality, it's about control. A leader's job isn't to be good, it's to be effective. Richardson nodded approvingly. Yes, an interesting perspective. The idea that power and ethics are fundamentally separate is one that has shaped entire civilizations. Michael raised his hand. For the first time in weeks, Richardson actually called on him. Michael! Michael sat forward, his voice calm but firm. That's a common misreading of Machiavelli. He never argued that ethics were irrelevant. He argued that a leader must be seen as ethical, even if their actions aren't. It's not about abandoning morality. It's about manipulating perception. The room went still. Josh frowned, shifting in his seat. That's just semantics. Michael turned slightly toward him. It's not semantics. It's the foundation of modern political strategy. Leaders don't just seize power, they manufacture consent. The most dangerous rulers aren't the ones who are openly ruthless. They're the ones who convince people their ruthlessness is justified. A murmur spread through the room. For once, people were actually listening to him. Richardson tilted his head, a slow smile forming on his lips. Interesting, he mused. But tell me, Michael, if that's true, then aren't all political leaders, past and present, just manipulators? Where do we draw the line between leadership and deception? Michael didn't hesitate. That line has never been clear, and the fact that we pretend it is, that's the real deception. A few students exchanged glances. Some were nodding. Richardson's expression flickered, just for a second, but Michael saw it. For the first time, the professor wasn't in control of the conversation. Josh scoffed, arms crossed. So what are you saying? That there's no such thing as an ethical leader? Michael turned his gaze toward him, unwavering. I'm saying that the system isn't built to reward ethics. It's built to reward power. You think the most successful people in history got there by playing fair? They got there by convincing everyone else that they were playing fair. Josh opened his mouth, then closed it. Richardson, however, recovered quickly. Fascinating perspective, Michael, he said smoothly. But tell me this, if ethics are nothing but a tool of perception, then what stops people from abandoning them entirely? If power is all that matters, then doesn't that justify any action in the pursuit of it? Michael paused. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. And he knew. This was the trap. If he said yes, he would be painted as someone who believed morality was meaningless. If he said no, he would be contradicting his own argument. But Michael had spent his whole life seeing through traps like this. So he smiled. That depends, Professor. Do you think fairness is real? Or do you just think it's useful? The question hit like a shockwave. The room went dead silent, because everyone knew what Michael was really asking. He wasn't just talking about leadership. He wasn't just talking about politics. He was talking about Wellington. He was talking about this very classroom. He was talking about Richardson himself. For the first time, Richardson didn't have a response ready. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his desk. Michael had forced him into a corner. A few seconds stretched unbearably long. Then, Richardson let out a slow chuckle. Well, he said smoothly, regaining his composure. I suppose that's a question worth pondering, but everyone knew what had just happened. Michael had won, and for the first time, Richardson couldn't hide it. The silence was suffocating. For a moment, Michael thought he had done it. He had argued flawlessly, backed up his points with logic so undeniable that even Richardson had been forced to acknowledge it. For the first time, It felt like the balance of power had shifted. And then, Richardson smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that signaled amusement. It was calculated, cold. And then, with the ease of a man who had played this game far longer than Michael, he spoke. Try Tuesday Kong Phi Luke now Kung Di Doi Voi Tu Catch. A few students stirred in their seats. Michael's breath caught in his chest. Mot so nuoi ko the ghi no tot. Richardson continued, voice smooth, deliberate, unhurried. And hung ho kong bao geo tuk suthwak veoine. And just like that, everything shifted. Michael felt it instantly, the weight of those words, the way they didn't need to be explicit to be understood. He could see it in the way students stopped breathing for a second, in the way their gazes flickered between Richardson and himself, in the uncomfortable tension that thickened the air. No one laughed, not even Josh, because this wasn't a joke. This was a declaration. You don't belong here, not in this university, not in this discussion, not in their world. Michael should have been used to it by now. The quiet exclusions, the veiled dismissals, the unspoken rules that said no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough. But hearing it said aloud, in front of everyone, was different, because now there were no more illusions. Richardson had always believed this, and now he didn't even feel the need to hide it. Sarah's fingers clenched into fists beneath the desk. She wanted to say something. She wanted to scream, but her voice felt trapped in her throat, because if she spoke up, what would happen? Would Richardson shut her down just as easily? Would the rest of the class turn against her too? Would Michael appreciate the defense? Or would it make things worse? So she did nothing, just like everyone else. No one moved, no one spoke, because this was how Wellington worked. Even those who saw the injustice wouldn't fight it, because to fight it meant risking their own place. So they sat in silence, letting the weight of Richardson's words settle into the walls of the lecture hall like an undeniable truth. Michael didn't flinch. He didn't react. He just sat there, staring at Richardson, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing any kind of response. But inside, something shifted, because now this wasn't just about proving he was smart. This was about proving he belonged, and he would make sure they never forgot it. Michael sat at his desk, staring at the blank complaint form on his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. For the first time in his life, he wasn't questioning whether he was right. He knew he was. The evidence was there. The patterns were obvious. The bias wasn't just speculation anymore. It was real, undeniable, inescapable. And yet, something inside him hesitated. Filing this complaint meant more than just documenting unfair grading practices or biased treatment. It meant declaring war. It meant forcing the university to look at itself in a way it didn't want to. It meant putting a target on his back, branding himself as a problem. Because students who played along, who kept their heads down and accepted their place, they survived. But students who challenged the system, who tried to expose it, they didn't. Michael knew that. Sarah had warned him, but he also knew something else. If he didn't fight this now, he never would. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every other student who had been dismissed, ignored, pushed aside. And Michael Carter had never been one to walk away from a fight. He took a deep breath, and then he started typing. Formal complaint, academic bias and discrimination. Student name Michael Carter. Course Political Ethics. Professor James Richardson. Issue consistent grading disparities and discriminatory classroom practices. Michael wrote. He detailed every instance. Every time Richardson had skipped over him in class. Every time his grades had been suspiciously lower than his white peers. Every time he had been dismissed, undermined, told he didn't belong. He included exam scores, graded assignments, statistical comparisons. It wasn't just a complaint. It was proof. Cold, hard, indisputable. But as he typed, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Would they even take it seriously? Or would they brush it aside with polite emails and empty reassurances? Would they call him into a meeting, nod sympathetically, promise to look into the matter, only for nothing to change? Michael knew how these things worked. He had seen it before. A complaint like this wasn't just paperwork. It was a challenge. And the university, it would fight back. They would protect Richardson. They would protect their reputation. They would do everything in their power to make sure Michael lost. His hand trembled slightly as he moved the cursor to the submit button, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. This was it. This was the moment where he chose to fight. Michael exhaled, and then he clicked send. It was done. There was no taking it back now. No more wondering, no more second-guessing. The moment his complaint hit the administration system, the game changed. Michael wasn't just a student anymore. He was a challenger. And no matter what happened next, he was ready. But just as he closed his laptop, his phone buzzed. A notification. Michael glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Sarah, or maybe an automated response from the administration. But it wasn't. It was an email from Professor Richardson. Michael's stomach clenched. He hesitated just for a second before opening it. The message was short. Michael, I'd like to have a word with you after class tomorrow. I assume you know what this is about. No greeting, no signature, just a message dripping with quiet authority. Michael stared at the screen, his pulse pounding in his ears, because now it wasn't just about the complaint. Now Richardson knew, and tomorrow there would be consequences. Waiting had never been Michael's style. He had sent the complaint. He had taken the first step. But he knew better than to think that was enough. The university would stall. They would delay, investigate, gather evidence. They would drown his complaint in bureaucratic red tape until it became just another unresolved case buried in the system. Michael wasn't going to give them that chance. If they wanted to pretend he was invisible, then he would make himself impossible to ignore. That night, he made a choice. He wouldn't wait. He wouldn't hesitate. He would dominate. And the battlefield, the final exams. Michael had always been a hard worker, but this was something else. He doubled his study hours. He reviewed every lecture, every textbook, every note. He didn't just prepare for the test. ***, he prepared to leave no room for doubt. ***, he wasn't aiming to pass. He wasn't even aiming to excel. He was aiming to break the system from the inside out, because they could manipulate grades, but they couldn't manipulate perfection. Sarah noticed the change immediately. "Michael, you need sleep." Michael barely looked up from his laptop. "I need to win," she sighed, setting down her coffee. "You already proved you're the smartest person in this program. What else do you need to prove?" Michael finally met her gaze. His voice was calm. "That they can't erase me." Sarah swallowed, nodding slowly. She understood, because this wasn't just about a test anymore. This was Michael's final stand. The nights stretched into mornings. The library became his second home. While others crammed at the last minute, Michael mastered every concept down to its core. While others relied on privilege and connections, Michael relied on knowledge. Because at the end of the day, they could deny him opportunities. They could overlook him, but they could not outthink him. And when the day of the exam arrived, Michael walked in not as a student, but as a reckoning. Michael had always worked hard, but now it was something else entirely. It wasn't just studying. It was a campaign. A full force, no holds barred, strategic attack on everything they thought they could use against him. Because if they were going to deny him recognition, he would force them to acknowledge him. Not through protests, not through complaints, but through undeniable, relentless excellence. The library became his second home. Day after day, night after night, Michael sat in the same seat, surrounded by stacks of books and notes. His world shrank to a cycle of reading, writing, memorizing, analyzing. He didn't just study the material, ***, he mastered it. ***. Every theory, every historical precedent, every complex argument. Asterisk asterisk, he absorbed it all. Asterisk asterisk. While others skimmed chapters, Michael dissected them. While others highlighted key points, Michael rewrote entire arguments from scratch. He wasn't preparing for a test. He was preparing to obliterate every expectation they had of him. And it wasn't just textbooks. Michael threw himself into every academic opportunity available. When there was a guest lecture, he was in the front row. When there was a research symposium, he signed up to present. When there was an open forum, he made sure his voice was heard. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. They were used to him being quiet. Now, Michael was everywhere, and there was no ignoring him anymore. Sarah watched in awe. She had always known Michael was brilliant, but this was something different. One evening, she found him in the library, again, scribbling notes faster than she had ever seen. "Michael, you need sleep." Michael barely looked up. "I need to win," she sighed, setting down her coffee. "You already proved you're the smartest person in this program. What else do you need to prove?" Michael finally met her gaze. His voice was calm. "That they can't erase me." Sarah swallowed, nodding slowly. She understood, because this wasn't just about a test anymore. This was Michael's final stand. The nights stretched into mornings. The library lights flickered as closing time approached, but Michael never left early. He stayed until the last possible minute, until the janitors came in, until his vision blurred from exhaustion. He knew how the system worked. They could deny him scholarships. They could deny him opportunities. They could even deny him recognition. But they could not deny results. If his test scores were so perfect, so undeniable, they would have no choice but to acknowledge him. He would force them to see. And then the tests began. One after another, Michael sat in those silent halls, pen in hand, and wrote like a man on a mission. There were no hesitations, no second-guessing. He knew every answer before he even read the question. Because this was the moment he had prepared for. He didn't just pass. He set records, highest scores, best analysis, flawless execution. Each time a professor graded his exam, they were left with no room for doubt. His essays were impeccable. His problem-solving was precise. His arguments were unshakable. He was no longer a student. He was a force. Josh saw it. Emily saw it. Richardson saw it. The whole damn university saw it. Because Michael Carter wasn't just succeeding anymore. He was dominating. And for the first time, they all realized there was no stopping him now. Then came the whispers. "Did you hear about Carter? I heard he aced every exam this semester. They're saying he might be the top graduate." The murmurs started in classrooms, then in hallways, then in faculty offices. Michael's name was being spoken by people who had never acknowledged him before. Professors, deans, administrators, and even those who had tried to hold him back. Asterisk asterisk, even Richardson. Asterisk asterisk were beginning to understand. Michael Carter was no longer someone they could ignore. First, no one noticed. Michael had always been a good student, one of the best even, but in a school where connections mattered more than competence, being good had never been enough. But now people were starting to talk. It started with whispers, in the hallways, in the library, in study groups and lunch tables. "Did you hear about Carter? I heard he aced every exam this semester. They're saying he might be the top graduate." Michael's name was being spoken by people who had never acknowledged him before. At first, it was just idle curiosity. Then it became something else. Professors began paying attention. His essays were circulated among faculty as examples of exceptional work. His analyses were referenced in lectures. His performance on exams was so flawless that some instructors even double-checked their grading. Asterisk asterisk, not to look for mistakes, but to make sure they hadn't miscalculated a perfect score. Asterisk asterisk. Michael wasn't just succeeding, he was breaking records, and that was something no one could ignore. Even students who had never spoken to him before started to notice. Some were impressed, Some were curious, and some, like Josh and Emily, were furious. Josh especially hated it. Every time Michael's name appeared at the top of a grade sheet, Josh's frustration deepened. He had always believed that people like him were supposed to be at the top. Now, a guy he had dismissed as lucky was outperforming him in every single way. One afternoon, after another exam score was posted, Josh slammed his books onto the table in frustration. "This is bullshit." Emily glanced at him. "What is?" Josh scoffed. "Carter, he's not that smart. I don't know how the hell he's doing it, but there's no way he's actually better than everyone." Emily smirked. "Maybe he's just working harder." Josh scowled. "Or maybe he's cheating." Emily rolled her eyes. "You sound desperate." But Josh wasn't listening, because to him, there was no other explanation. Even Professor Richardson had to acknowledge it. He didn't want to. He had spent months, years, even ignoring Michael, pretending he wasn't worth paying attention to. Now, the entire faculty was talking about him. Now, other professors were praising his work. Now, administrators were mentioning his name in meetings. Michael Carter was becoming a name that carried weight. And that was something Richardson could no longer ignore. But Michael didn't care about the attention. He didn't care about the whispers, the admiration, or the resentment. He only cared about one thing: winning. Because this was just the beginning. The auditorium was packed. Rows of students in black gowns and caps sat with their hands folded in their laps, their gazes fixed on the grand stage ahead. Faculty members lined the front, their expressions composed, professional. The air buzzed with murmured conversations, quiet laughter, and the occasional shuffle of robes as students adjusted their seats. But underneath it all, there was tension, because this wasn't just a graduation ceremony. This was a moment of reckoning. Michael sat near the center, his hands resting on his lap, his back straight. He wasn't nervous. He had done everything possible. He had outperformed every expectation. He had dominated every exam, every discussion, every academic challenge thrown at him. There was nothing left to prove. And yet, the weight of this moment pressed down on him. Because today, the university would have to make a choice. Would they acknowledge his brilliance? Or would they find a way to deny him? One last time? A few seats over, Josh sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He wasn't smiling. He had expected to be here today, sitting among the top graduates, waiting to hear his name called first. That was how it was supposed to be. But now there was doubt. And that doubt had one name: Michael Carter. The murmurs in the crowd began to fade as the university president, an older man with graying hair and a deep voice, stepped up to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and smiled at the sea of graduates before him. Today, we celebrate excellence. A round of polite applause filled the room. The students sitting before me have demonstrated dedication, perseverance, and an unyielding commitment to knowledge. But among them, a select few have distinguished themselves beyond all expectations. Michael remained still. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. The announcement of the top student. The one whose name would go down in the university's history. The one who would stand as a symbol of achievement. The one whose success would be undeniable. Michael's heartbeat was steady. He had earned this. The only question was, would they have the courage to admit it? The room fell into absolute silence. Every breath was held. Every eye was locked on the stage. Michael's fingers curled slightly against his gown, but his expression remained unreadable. This was it. The university president adjusted his glasses, glanced at the paper in his hands, then looked back at the audience. "And now," he began, his voice echoing through the auditorium, "it is my honor to announce this year's valedictorian." The pause stretched. Too long. Deliberate. Michael could feel it. The weight of hesitation. The final moment before truth collided with expectation. And then, our top graduate, the valedictorian of this year's class, is... Another pause. A fraction of a second, but long enough for doubt to creep into Michael's mind. Would they do it? Would they deny him one last time? Then, Michael Carter. The words rang through the auditorium. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the silence shattered. Gasps, scattered applause, shock. Josh's head snapped toward Michael, his mouth slightly open. Emily blinked in disbelief. Professor Richardson's face remained perfectly still. And Michael? Michael exhaled. Asterisk asterisk slow, steady. Asterisk asterisk. Because finally, asterisk asterisk finally asterisk asterisk. They had no choice but to say it. He had won. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire room seemed frozen in time, as if no one had expected to hear the name Michael Carter come from the lips of the university president. And then, the first clap. Soft, hesitant. Then another, until suddenly, asterisk asterisk, the auditorium erupted in applause. Asterisk asterisk. Michael inhaled slowly, steadying himself as he rose from his seat. He had imagined this moment before, had dreamed of it, but nothing, asterisk asterisk, nothing asterisk asterisk, could have prepared him for what it felt like to stand up and see the sea of faces staring at him. Some were cheering, some were stunned, and some couldn't believe what had just happened. Josh sat stiffly, hands gripping the edge of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw clenched. This wasn't possible. Michael wasn't supposed to win. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Emily sat beside him, her lips slightly parted, her brows furrowed in disbelief. For months, she had dismissed him. For years, she had assumed his success was a fluke, a stroke of luck, an anomaly. But now she couldn't deny it. None of them could. And then there was Professor Richardson. He remained perfectly still, his hands clasped in front of him, his face unreadable. But his eyes, asterisk asterisk, his eyes said everything. Asterisk asterisk. Shock, rage, defeat. Michael met his gaze as he stepped into the aisle. For the first time, it wasn't Richardson looking down at him. It was Michael looking ahead, past him, beyond him, because this moment belonged to Michael, and there was nothing Richardson could do to take it away. The applause grew louder as Michael made his way toward the stage. He walked with purpose, with dignity, with the unshakable confidence of a man who had earned his place. He passed rows of students who had once ignored him, who had once doubted him, who had once thought he didn't belong. And now they clapped for him. Now they had to, because Michael Carter had done what none of them thought possible. He hadn't just won. He had rewritten the rules. The applause was still ringing in Michael's ears as he stepped onto the stage. The university president greeted him with a warm smile, handing him the certificate, but Michael barely noticed, because just a few feet away stood Professor Richardson, the man who had spent the entire year ignoring him, dismissing him, doubting him, and now he had no choice but to acknowledge him. Richardson's expression was unreadable, but Michael could see it, the tightness in his jaw, the rigidness in his stance, the way his fingers curled just slightly before he forced them to relax. He didn't want to do this, but he had to, because the entire auditorium was watching. And so, with a slow, deliberate movement, Richardson extended his hand. Michael didn't hesitate. He reached forward, gripping the professor's hand firmly. Their eyes met. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Michael didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He didn't need to, because standing here was already victory enough. Richardson, for the first time, had to look up at him, had to shake his hand, had to recognize him. And even though his lips remained in a neutral line, his eyes said everything. He had lost, and he knew it. Michael stepped down from the stage, diploma in hand, feeling the weight of every step. He had done it. He had won. But as he made his way back to his seat, he noticed the looks, the averted gazes, the stiff shoulders, the quiet discomfort that settled over those who had once mocked him. And then, Josh, Emily, both sitting motionless, their expressions unreadable. For once, they had nothing to say. Josh's hands clenched into fists on his lap. He should have been the one up there. He had always believed that. But now he couldn't even look at Michael. So instead, he looked down. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But Michael saw it. And he knew. For the first time, Josh recognized his defeat. Emily exhaled softly, her shoulders dropping. She didn't speak, didn't offer excuses, just a slow nod, a quiet acknowledgement of something she had refused to admit before. Michael had earned this, and she knew it. Then, from the side, a voice. Michael. Michael turned. It was Daniel, one of Josh's friends, someone who had once laughed at the jokes, who had once ignored him. He hesitated, then extended a hand. I was wrong about you. A murmur rippled through the students around them, and one by one, others followed. Some shook his hand, some simply nodded, some whispered a quiet, "Congratulations." It wasn't much, but it was something, and for Michael that was enough. For a moment, Michael stood still. The applause had begun to fade. The whispers had settled. The weight of everything, the struggles, the doubts, the battles fought in silence, pressed against his chest. He had done it. But even now, with the diploma in his hands, with the entire school forced to acknowledge his success, it still didn't feel real. And then, Sarah stood up. At first, she was the only one, a single figure rising in a sea of seated graduates. Her hands came together. Asterisk, asterisk, once, twice, 3 times. Asterisk, asterisk, until the crisp sound of applause filled the room again. And then, asterisk, asterisk, she smiled. Asterisk, asterisk. It wasn't just pride. It was vindication. She had always known. From the very beginning, she had seen the fire in him, the strength, the brilliance. She had watched as the world tried to push him down. And now the world had no choice but to see him too. Michael met her gaze. For the first time since stepping onto that stage, he smiled back. Because this wasn't just about proving himself to the university. This was about proving something far greater, that he had always belonged. And now, finally, everyone knew it. Success is never just about talent. It's not just about intelligence. It's about endurance, about pushing forward when the world tells you to stop, about standing your ground when everyone around you says you don't belong. And Michael Carter? He had done just that. He had walked into a university where people like him were expected to fade into the background, to work twice as hard for half the recognition, to accept unfair treatment without complaint, to exist but never thrive. But Michael refused to be invisible. He didn't fight back with anger. He didn't waste his energy on proving others wrong. He simply proved himself right. And in doing so, he had done something far greater than just becoming valedictorian. He had forced people to see. His classmates who once dismissed him. Now they saw his name at the top of every list. Now they knew his achievements weren't luck, they were earned. His professors who once overlooked him. Now they referenced his work. Now they recognized his intellect, his dedication, his brilliance. Even Richardson, who had done everything in his power to hold Michael back, had been forced to do the one thing he had never wanted to do. Shake his hand. Acknowledge his success. And in that moment, Michael knew. Asterisk, asterisk, he had won more than a title. Asterisk, asterisk. He had won respect. But the most important victory, the one that mattered more than any award, any diploma, any title, he had proven. Asterisk, asterisk, once and for all. Asterisk, asterisk. That hard work beats prejudice. That determination dismantles barriers. That no matter how many times the world tries to push you down, you rise. And in rising, you don't just change your own life. You change the way people see the world. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't always look like grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to give up. Refusing to accept the roles others have assigned to you. Refusing to let unfairness define your future. Michael Carter could have accepted his fate, and no one would have blamed him if he did. He could have stayed silent. He could have let Richardson's words bury him. He could have allowed the system to push him aside. He could have convinced himself that this was just the way things were, that no matter how hard he worked, he would never win. And in doing so, he would have become exactly what they expected him to be: invisible. But Michael chose courage. Courage to speak when others told him to stay quiet. Courage to stand up when others expected him to sit down. Courage to fight, not with anger, not with resentment, but with excellence. Because in the end, it wasn't just intelligence that made Michael succeed. It was the will to keep going, the unshakable belief that he deserved better. And that belief, that courage, changed everything. Change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because of one complaint, one argument, or even one victory. But sometimes, all it takes is one person to force the conversation. And Michael Carter had done exactly that. His success wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a statement, a challenge to the system that had tried to ignore him, a reminder that talent can't be dismissed, no matter how much people try. And the university, they had to respond. In the weeks after graduation, discussions began. Faculty meetings were called. Emails circulated. The administration couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Michael's story had spread too far, reached too many ears. Students were talking. Parents were talking. The media was talking. And when pressure builds, institutions have no choice but to act. Within months, policy changes were announced. Grading systems were reviewed to ensure transparency and fairness. Faculty members were required to undergo bias training. A new student advisory board was formed, one that included voices like Michael's. And while some resisted the changes, the shift had already begun. Because now there was proof. Proof that discrimination wasn't just a theory, it had been real, tangible, documented. And proof that one person's determination could shake an entire institution. Michael didn't stay to watch the changes unfold. He had fought his battle. He had won. And now, he was ready for something bigger. Because this victory, it wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning.